Hello and welcome to the Space Podcast. I'm Guy Stanley from Stansons, your host. And today I'm chatting to Jeni Dursken, the Associate Director of Strategic Design at M Moser Associates, a global brand that design and deliver workplaces to bring out the best in people. Jeni's had a really varied experience across Toronto and London, making this conversation super interesting. Jeni, you've got a background outside of the UK, so what brought you here?
So I started in Toronto, and I was enjoying what I was doing at the time, which was working with a developer. Mm-hmm. And our studio was actually in-house with a developer. So there was a lot of insight as to how designs were made, decisions were made, pricing was considered, different supply chains. But the timeline for a project was quite extended. So my very first day, the first thing that I did at that studio was to work on my background as marketing. And they knew this. So I started working on the logo for this massive development. And they had a bunch in front of me and they said, choose one, make your case as to why. We'll sit down with the CEO, talk about it. We'll make a decision and then on to the next thing, head to site. So that was the very first thing. And then the very last thing I did over 4 years later, as I was leaving before I moved over to London, was going into that space that had finally been built, but was still in the process of being built. And went through, I think it was the lobby, the joinery was just going in, the lighting was just going in. It had been tiled the week before. But there was still a lot of decisions and still a lot of work to be done. And I just thought, it's just too long of a time frame for me. So when I came over to London, I was looking for something that would maybe be a bit punchier in terms of timing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I had consciously thought of workplace design. I never really worked in an office so much before that. It was always like smaller things. I did a lot of remote working. So I was remote almost 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So for me, I had never really thought of workplace design because I was quite outside of the office in terms of how I worked for so long. So yeah, just discussed it with a few people and looked into workplace design and had a great opportunity and here we are.
Fantastic. So what were your first memories of workspace design? Was it in the UK or Toronto?
Technically it was in Toronto. So our design studio and the developer was going to move our office from a beautiful old warehouse into the ground and first floor of one of their new developments. So we had kind of built a space for ourselves. We could shift it the way we wanted to. And like we did all of the other spaces, it could kind of change over the years while we were developing it and building it and planning it out. But for this one, it was interesting because we were looking at it from our perspectives rather than a client's perspective or someone who might live here down the line. So I was doing amenity spaces and penthouse suites and guest suites and things like that. And this one was more like, okay, how is this going to work? And it became a lot more personal because you're thinking, where am I going to be? And how close am I going to be to this person? And how far away are these offices from each other? And how does this work on a day-by-day basis? Because we're so used to how our office is now. We would shift regularly on different floors and different spaces within our own building. But creating something from scratch that you're choosing felt like a really different, very bespoke, unique, and personal decision. So that was the first one. Everything from, what does the lobby look like? And, do we have like a co-working space? We were talking about co-working spaces 10 years ago, within the lobby. So having these, booths and bench seating and communal seating that you could still work at. But because we were all used to being in and out, going to site and seeing suppliers and having different manufacturers come in, it needed to be quite fluid. It wasn't like we were going to be away in the background in offices hard to reach. We kind of had to be there on the floor. So that was I guess my first real foray. Technically my first workplace experience was day one of working with this design team. And it was for some guys that I knew who had started a production company. And the office, we think we have some unique architecture here, but they decided to have their production company in an old warehouse, which was very cool. But it was an old slaughterhouse for pigs.
Oh.
And if you know anything about slaughterhouses, the floors are actually concave.
Yeah.
For certain reasons.
Yeah. I can imagine.
So we had to fill the floors and then cover them properly to make sure that there was no echoing. And so creating these like boxes within boxes for the production studios. So that was my first actual foray into the place.
Did it come out a cool
super
project?
Cool.
Yeah, I bet.
We had made a reception desk out of like pallets, like timber pallets. And we had a whole bunch of like stuff. I had gone to this market and found old like antique vintage kind of stuff that wasn't too gory, but was cool for kind of the aesthetic of the time for the warehouse. But yeah, it was quite fun.
So you did a nod back to the whole.
We did a bit of a nod back without too much of a nod. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's cool though. You do have to bring in that history, don't you? And
specialty. I think that's the other thing that I learned was. One was like the offices and how are you utilizing that space or setting it up so that they're functional, but also open. And a big conversation was around like the psychological cues. So it was a production company of guys, and they were basically treating it like an extended bachelor pad, even though most of them were married. So it was like really cool metallic tiles throughout. It was really stunning. But they wanted this going straight into all of their glass-fronted, but not acoustically sound offices. And I had to dig really deep into finding specific reasons. I think I had like 9 different reasons for why we would recommend really strongly that they put carpet in the meeting room, in the offices. And I think we put it in the meeting room as well. But one of them was like the psychological change of this is more of a private conversation. This doesn't really want to be bouncing, like ideas bouncing off all of the hard surfaces. This is something that might need to be like a private conversation, something a little bit confidential. You might be on here yelling on the phone. You might be on here wanting to have a quiet phone conversation or discussion and not feel like the reverberation is in your ear. So trying to provide research and feedback and recommendations in such a way that the client doesn't feel like they're getting a design school lesson, I guess.
Yeah. That must have been fun.
It was fun, yeah.
Change management is probably like the biggest.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to see how certain things needed to be specialized, especially the production studios. I mean, that was next level. But even just finding the right lighting for over the boardroom, which was the only meeting room, which was also going to be where they were going to have most of their events as a team, and making sure that it fit the culture before I was conscious of workplace culture. It was how do we create a space that feels like you? And I had been doing a lot of residential design on the side, so I already kind of had that innate sense of how do we kind of create a personality or a character, and without that feeling like you're, screaming it from the rooftops from every angle. How do you kind of infuse that within the space so people feel it without it having to be, overly discussed.
I love that.
Yeah.
Love it when you go into a space, you just pick up like almost a culture by osmosis and like the vibe rather than it on words on the wall. Like, don't be a dickhead. Like, we don't necessarily need to know that.
This is what we do. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. So you have got a bit of a history of going to vintage shops and picking out like curating pieces and rather than buying off the shelves, which I love, by the way. I think it adds such a story. But does that add like a tremendous amount of work time? Like the decision-making process, is that just sit with you, or do you have to get stuff approved? Like, what does that look like?
It's been different on different projects. At my first design studio that I worked at, my boss and I were also good friends and we loved hanging out together. So we spent a lot of Saturdays going to vintage markets and going shopping, which was fine, but it definitely extends your week, which you don't get paid for as a designer, and the client's not necessarily paying for either. So I think there's a time and a place to doing that in such a way where you can fit it in during the week. But we now have more expectations and shorter timelines, and budgets are being cut, and inflation is, driving costs that much more. And it's difficult to find those unique items because it does take longer. And they might need a little bit of work or reupholstering or French polishing in order to get them to the same level of quality that would be considered brand new. That said, it also depends on the client. Some clients are like, this is amazing, let's just get something vintage, order it, and get it straight in. The thing about vintage, especially furniture, the same could be said for lighting because you might have to change the voltage, but with furniture is you see a picture and when it arrives, it can be quite different. Sometimes it's better than you're expecting and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm, amazing for choosing this, like hit the jackpot. And other times you're like, I can't believe I chose this thing. Like I've had both of those.
You had both, yeah.
Yeah, I've had both of those extremes. I've had one where a client's been like, what were you thinking? And I was like, I don't know, it looked pretty good in person. This is totally different. It's a bit like when you go on a blind date or like a date and you think you know what you're getting and it might be different. So yeah, a little bit of that. Yeah, you're kind of doing semi-blind dating when you are ordering vintage furniture. Lighting, not so much. Lighting is usually, I'd say, pretty bang on, but furniture can be different, especially with upholstery, because you're never really sure what it's going to come out
or feel like.
Yes.
Or
yeah.
colours.
Yeah. And if you take the picture right, I mean, you're always putting your best foot forward. So yeah. I've had a couple surprises where I'm just like, I cannot believe, like, is there any way that we can send this back? Whereas when you have something brand new, typically, like you're doing a showroom tour, the client's coming to see it, everybody likes, you do a full 360, you see it from the back, the front, the sides. But that doesn't happen necessarily when you're ordering something from wherever and it just arrives. So you're kind of crossing your fingers. Yeah. So it's a bit of a gamble. If you're short on time, it is more difficult because it takes longer. Yeah. It takes longer to assemble all the pieces, to do the ordering and get the deliveries, and someone needs to be there. And sometimes there are the duties or delivery charges that come after the fact when it's like, it is more work. But when it's done right, especially within the right context and the right project, because I don't know that it's right for, it could be and should be right for all projects, but at the moment, based on what we do, it can be more difficult. But if you get it right, it is pretty incredible. It's a good feeling.
Yeah, well, amazing feeling. It's got to be, the person's got to have the appetite for it. When you say it's right for the right project, I do agree every project could have it, but some people just don't want that look and feel or just don't want that. Yeah, so no, I agree. Looping back to you coming over to the UK. Sorry, I went off. I love vintage furniture and I know you've got a great history in it. Hopefully it will come up again. But when you came to the UK, what are the main sort of culture differences in the ways of working that you noticed? Because I know we're an extremely different country in lots of ways.
Yeah. North Americans there's different, I can't remember what this is called specifically, but it's basically a different way of like a speaking language or understanding language. And part of that is body language. Some of it is like speaking and understanding. And some of it is like the listening. So there's like a kind of like a sublingual element to what we do. So even though we're both speaking English, we're speaking slightly different Englishes based on where we're from. North Americans have a more direct approach. Our way of softening things is to sandwich, something positive with maybe a little bit of feedback and then something more positive. That can be seen in other cultures as, are you trying to like send us in a different path? Or maybe the feedback isn't really that important because it's not the first thing that you said or the last thing that you said. So it can be interpreted and approached quite differently. So I would say that was probably the first one that I understood, was how I came across. Much more assertive than British cultural tendencies, I guess. And the other one I would say is that I got, and again, this is like how we're both being seen, is that I remember having, this still happens, but now I can see it happening, would have conversations, and this tends to be with a certain demographic of people. But they'll say something in their minds, they've said something, and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, you haven't actually said anything. You've literally said that you're hinting at something, but you haven't actually told, like, we could be talking about anything. We could be talking about polar bears or the Ice Age. Like, I have no, and they're just like, I trust all is clear. I'm like, nothing is clear whatsoever. Like, I'm totally lost on what we're talking about. But you're kind of smiling and nodding like, yeah, like, I think maybe I could assume what we might have been talking about based on what you're hinting. Like, so it's interesting how you can be speaking the same language, but not understanding each other, or not understanding the implication that you're trying to get across without maybe being too direct or not direct enough.
Yeah, I've got a lot of overseas connections. Shall I put it that way?
Yes, we have discussed this. Yeah,
and I'm just laughing so much because it's the sort of thing that I hear the whole time, that just the culture is just so different. People will expect to move to England and it to be the weather or the busy city or something like that hits you, but it's not. It's the culture, but you can't explain that. It's like impossible to explain.
And I foolishly, as someone who travels a lot, I really didn't anticipate this, but coming over here, I just kind of anticipated like going with the flow. And I didn't realize how much of a learning curve there was going to be, not just to different words that we use in our design language, like our design vocabulary. So things like in North America, we'll say backsplash, and here it's splash back. You know, the days of the week. So a week will start on a different day. So in North America, your week starts on a Sunday. Here it starts on a Monday. Like little things. So when you're starting to put like week commencing, like it means completely different things depending on which day you're putting it. Like just all these small things when I first came over that didn't really need to trip me up so much, but it's like one more little hiccup or like one more little bump as you're trying to kind of get into the flow and rhythm of things. So different words, different ways of saying things or not saying things. What else? I think if I had moved straight from Vancouver or the States to here, I think there's certain things that I would have had an even more difficult time with. So like pronouncing certain things, like Gloucestershire. Like I know because I had a Gloucester like road just up the road from me in Toronto. Like it's York. York is Toronto. Like and so there's a lot of words that are like very British, and so you have to know how to pronounce them like the British would have said, like how you actually say it. People from Vancouver, no concept, because it's like a completely different world. So I think I was in some ways better equipped for certain things, and in other ways really had no concept or didn't anticipate it, or maybe didn't ask my friends what I should be considering. But I feel like my friends also, for a few of them, because I have a few friends who I had gone to school with, like high school with, when I moved over here. And one of them had moved over when she was 18, and another maybe 5 years before me. So I think you kind of forget about, you tend to forget the impact or the dynamic of when you first came over. But it was a lot more than I was expecting. That's for sure. I am not surprised. I would be surprised if you said it was the other way. Like, I'm not surprised it was more than you're expecting at all. I think there is so much, I just call it mindset. Mindset is different, but it's just so much. It's just a way of thinking. How that translate out into like the business world and the way you work and provide feedback or present or talk to your colleagues. And London is like its own microcosm too, or macrocosm within the UK too. So the multicultural kind of groups that you hang out with are also going to shift, or depending on where you work. So I've worked in one design studio, and we used to call it the United Nations of designers, sitting at this bench, because it was people literally from all over, and everyone is first generation. Whereas in Toronto, it was also multicultural, but everyone was second or third generation. So they had grown up in Canada. So even though they were Italian or Serbian or whatever, they were more Canadian because they had grown up there, even though they had really strong roots. Whereas here, it's like, if you're Italian, like, you moved over last year, like, you are Italian.
Yeah.
So and trying to explain that to people, like, yeah, I know we're multicultural, but actually this is even, like, it's not that it's a watered down version, but it's not a Canadianized version of it, where you meet in the middle. They can understand where you're coming from. And this is like a cultural thing, why different cultures find themselves gravitating to each other, because there's these unsaid things that we just understand about each other. And I think in workplace, you want to work in a company with a culture where you fit in. You don't have to try to fit in. And that's, depending on the company at the moment, is going to make or break things. And I think it's going to make or break things a lot more in the future with Gen Z, but also just with our standard of living and cost of living, and having different factors outside of work that you're then bringing into and influencing where you want to be. And can you understand me, or are you coming from a different class? I know we say that we don't have classes here, but that was also another, like, huge thing. It is still classist. But you might feel that at certain places, depending on who's in leadership or who's on your team or how someone got their job. Like, that can be a really big driver as well. So I think the idea of belonging, which is coming up more and more as part of, it's the fourth letter as part of DEI. It's now DEIB, where, yes, I want to feel included and I want to see some diversity, and hopefully I am comfortable enough to see that diversity and want to include everyone, not having anyone on the periphery feeling like I don't belong here. But that belonging is a really big part of it. So you can feel included, but you don't necessarily have to feel like you belong. And that's what I'd like to see changing more and more is it's like a really authentic, I feel like I'm meant to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think and it's how people actually feel like they belong. They don't relax and get comfortable and then bring them full selves to work, and then all the raft of benefits that you get from that, which don't need to cover, like, we can Google those. But I mean, bringing your whole self to work is so important.
Definitely.
Zooming forward to today, what is your role at Moser?
Great question. So my role encompasses a little bit of everything, which is really nice. So I see my role as really being a communicator for all of the different channels and services that we provide. And that amongst other things, but my role with clients especially is to help unlock hidden value. That's my thing. And on a project, I see myself as a bit of like a diamond miner. So I'm trying to find something that can be the differentiator or the industry disruptor or something transformative, but something that makes a project really unique. And it could be around sustainability or decarbonization. It could be specific to the client, where we have a marketing opportunity that really aligns with maybe their ESG initiatives. And I can go into more details of all of these. It could be an opportunity to try something on a smaller scale, where we learn and share lessons learned and use that as a benchmarking project to then scale up on future projects. It could be new partnerships. For some of my projects, it's taking a client that we have maybe partnered with around the world, globally on different projects. We just finished one where we've done 35 projects globally. We did the London project and it was completely different, and it's super awesome because it doesn't match with anything else. And it's become a bit of like the test bed, not quite the guinea pig because we always knew it would work, but it's the test bed for this is how you match up your own region to what we're doing in this space. So it feels quite different. And it really speaks to the ethos of the company as well. So culturally, it's more aligned. It feels less like, in this case, a law firm and more like a tech company. And that was really what we were driving at the whole time. So everything from the technology itself to the furniture and different furniture layout typologies, space typologies, the colors and the tones, everything just feels like a big shift. The lighting even, it doesn't feel like you've stepped into a law firm, which was the whole point. So yeah, finding those little nuggets. And on some projects, it might be 2 or 3 things, but then you're kind of elevating those to the next level. So I don't work on all of the projects, whereas I used to a few years ago. Now I work on a smaller amount, but it's more like, where can I really add value to these in slightly different ways? So yeah, that's kind of my role.
Yeah, I love the variety.
Definitely.
What's a golden rule you live by then?
I don't know how I would phrase this, but it kind of it jumps off of the idea of do unto others, like you would have them do unto you. And it's more of a mindset or perspective of being more empathetic to what you don't know, and constantly reminding yourself of, is this thing is happening, and it's not necessarily happening to me, but I can approach it in a slightly different way. So if someone is walking a little bit slower and I'm in a rush, for example, maybe they just got out of the hospital or had surgery, or maybe just had some bad news, or whatever the situation is, but you're trying to look at it slightly differently. And so whether that be, I'm not hearing back from a client, maybe something has happened, whether in the business or personally, waiting to hear back from something or approval, or from a colleague. If it's something bigger, like this project didn't happen, it's like, okay, like what can we do, and how do we approach this in a way where we can think of maybe how someone else has been displaced, or just their perspective on it a little bit more.
More mindful of other people's feelings and what they're
and
going through.
What you don't know what you don't know, right? So really considering, it's not necessarily something that's happening to me for a bad reason. It actually could be something that's happening to them. So
that sounds like a really interesting position to be in, unlocking that hidden value with clients. So what are you working on at the moment with your teams that kind of you're implementing that, if you like?
Yeah. At the moment, part of what I do is project-based. Some of what I do is marketing-based. And some of what I do is client business development, client services based. So it kind of goes back and forwards. You need a project to talk about to clients to kind of build something, but equally you want to get into an actual project instead of just talking about what you used to do or what you have done or what you recently completed. So there's constantly multiple plates spinning. At the moment, we have a few different campaigns, depending on the type of client or how the market is going too. So we're talking about neurodiversity. We're talking about legal, I don't want to say trends, I would say shifts in the industry. So how is the legal industry really transforming in the future? So more insights into that. And also the idea of, when to refurbish versus relocating. So the whole stay or go kind of idea. We have some clients who know that they are going to move. It's just a question of when, including ourselves. So we've been in a situation where it wasn't a stay or go. It was like, okay, we have to go. And some clients know that. Some clients call us in to confirm that their aspirations also align from a business case perspective. So building that and speaking to the wider team and outlining why a go scenario actually works, or, if the building works for you and you don't need as much space, or you do need more space, do you maybe change your working patterns and your working styles and you can actually make it work? Maybe it's a phased in occupancy fit out update where you kind of go floor by floor, and maybe you're doing more prototyping on each floor and you're learning as you go rather than doing it all at once. So I tend to work with clients typically longer term, so ahead of the project, especially if we are, one, doing a Sterago study, which will be my workplace strategy team who would be doing that. But I might also jump in when we're doing the business search and helping them ensure that the building aligns with what those aspirations look like and the bigger vision and the long-term goals. And then making sure that the design then brings in all of those kind of past discussions, also highlights why we chose this building. And if there are certain reasons that we chose this building, making sure that we aren't concealing or without really realizing it, almost like, hiding or covering up certain things. So we had a project recently where it's a more industrial building, not super industrial, but we definitely wanted to make sure that the beams and the columns were kind of celebrated within this like industrial aesthetic. But the rest of the office and the workplace isn't overly industrial, but it's a bit of like a nod. And certain decisions had to be made from a building control perspective and fire safety. And so it's just making sure that we're picking the right building, but then also staying true to why we've made this decision with clients, rather than just kind of full steam ahead and forgetting about all the work that's been done. So little things like that. Sometimes it's the big picture, 5, 10, 15-year plans. And sometimes it's the small details, like we really need to make sure that we celebrate this moment or this element of a building because this is why we've chosen it.
Yeah, I love that you bring up stay or go, like relocate to refurbish, like which to do. Is there some key considerations that a workplace property director should bear in mind when they're making that kind of decision? It's quite a fine line, I guess.
I mean, it's different for every single company, I would say.
Sure.
Depends on the building. So fundamentally, is the building supporting what you need it to do, both now and in the future? So if you are drastically changing how you're going to be working, you probably want a big grand unveiling. So staying in the same office, you're going to have a hard time because everyone is seeing how much has this changed, rather than it's a completely different environment. It's like getting something tailored to fit you a little bit better that you already didn't feel like really worked for you, versus getting something bespoke that's going to fit you as soon as you put it on. Like that's I think maybe a good analogy.
I like it.
You feel different, you don't have the bias from before, all of those feelings. And I think when people get to the point, this is the same thing with residential. If you're thinking of moving or you're moving out of a place, if you have flatmates, for example, if you're in a situation and you know that you are leaving, like you can see the clock ticking and you're counting down. Once you get to that countdown, there's no looking back. No amount of fresh paint or new hardwood floors or a new sofa or fabulous new lighting is going to fix, because you have almost been making a list subconsciously of all the stuff that doesn't work. So when you know you're moving, you really need it to be something new. So I think a grand unveiling can be good if you are fundamentally changing how people are working. So it's more for like the transformative projects. If it is a refresh, if it is, I have a lot of clients who have legacy addresses. This is especially the situation in New York. So think of like Lexington Avenue or Park Ave, or, there's certain addresses that they just don't want to give up, but they don't know what to do with their space, or they have too much space, or they can't get people to come back to the office. Then it's a situation of, if you were to relocate, would you have new amenities both around you as well as inside the office, inside your building, that actually support you better going forward? Or is it a situation where maybe the landlord is willing to make some updates and upgrades to your current building. And I've also seen that with clients where it's like, okay, we're getting a new rooftop terrace. They're finally changing the reception. It's going to look cool. We're getting better end of journey facilities. So people will cycle in now, which was a big barrier to entry before because of the cost of transportation, So there's like a few things. Cost can be an inhibitor. I think program. And it's interesting because if a client is having their office space refitted with a refurbishment, it might be cheaper in the short term, but you also need to consider that you might have to be then moving out in order to do the refurbishment to then move back in. So depending on how long that program is and what actually is required, I mean, if you're putting in a new staircase and you're shutting down 3 of the floors, you're out of that space for quite some time. Do you then need a new space? And what does that cost? And do you have to refit something else out at the moment? So we're looking with a large client at the moment and doing that cost analysis of, does it make sense to stay in a building which is a legacy address, has a decent terrace, but is quite deep and dark and doesn't actually do what they need it to do, and no one is really tied to the building itself. So if they were to move out, get the landlord to do all these works, they have to overhaul the systems. Okay, great. So you get new lighting and new services. It's the same building that you're moving into. But then you also have to figure, what are you doing with 1,000 people? And that's going to be at least a year, probably closer to 2 years of needing space while you refurbish this. Well, then you've done 2 relocations within that time. So there's a lot of things to consider when we're discussing this with a client. I wouldn't say always, but usually you have a pretty good indication as to whether they need to relocate, and it's easier when they actually need to, like, this building does not work, or it is going to cost marginally more for you to move out and relocate than all of the works to get this place up to the level that you need it for the future, especially with all of the new sustainability regulations coming in as well. So that's like the long-term thinking. But every once in a while you get a surprise. So that's also fun.
Yeah, that's really great. So when people are doing a project brief and they're bringing you on board, as in these teams, what point do they bring you in, or what point should they bring you in?
I would say for our team, earlier is better. I've had current projects that we're on board with 6 or 7 years in advance. So it may not be the same team who's doing the design later on by any means, because it's the strategy team at the moment who's going to switch. But it could be anywhere from, I mean, I've had some clients who it's a few months, get brought in very last minute, to several years. I would say anywhere from 1 year to 3 years is typical, depending on how big of a space you are taking and how many people are involved. And realistically, this is also going to come down to your culture. How much are you including and engaging with your people? So it's going to be leadership dependent. So how is the internal team making decisions? Who is being enabled to make those decisions? Have they done this before? What sort of experience do they have? Are they new to the market? A lot of the times we have US clients and we'll be helping them out over here. So how many times are they realistically going to come back and forth? It's probably going to be hey, I'm going to come out, look for a building, do the search with you. I might spend 4 days back to back, 16-hour days with them looking for a place, but also talking about, what are the aspirations? What's the local team looking for? What is the managing director or the CEO looking for? What have you done in the past? What's worked well? What other projects do you have on the go? How would you like to shift gears for this one? So it tends to be quite fast and furious. It also depends on whether they want to do a full workplace strategy study. So do we need a stay or go study, or is it more come in, tell us what you recommend? Are they just at the point where it's like, hey, we're doing a building search on these days. I need you to join me. And then basically we need your recommendations. So it could kind of vary. And I've had clients who maybe haven't been as knowledgeable about our market as local kind of London clients who come across like they really know what they're doing, and they do know what they're doing, but the London market is quite different from other markets, from other real estate markets. So I think sometimes those intricacies can trip them up a little bit. And again, it goes back to the stakeholder, like who can actually make the decision. So I had one client who thought she was ready to go, had it all in hand. We had the place, we had everything set up, thought we were at the point of doing an HOT, but there was something internally that wasn't aligned, and we ended up losing the building. And she thought that she had been given the A-OK to move this forward, and internally someone else didn't realize that they hadn't given her that for someone else. So there was a bit of a divide internally as to how much autonomy and authority you actually have. And that's another thing that's, I guess, good to understand or delve into with clients is like, can you sign this off? Or do we need to have a different discussion? Or do you need approval from someone else? And that's a tricky conversation sometimes, because you don't want them to feel like they aren't, the Holy Grail. But the reality is, if they can't sign it off, then it could be 4 months down the road because maybe the solicitor isn't in place, or they don't understand that the HOTs means that they can't also be still looking at other buildings. Meanwhile, they haven't really made up their mind internally and they're still making decisions. I had a client who wanted their internal team to be working on things like the test fits. And I said, our team can do it because we know the regulations, we know the local regulations. We know what the local standards are from, for example, like an office perspective or a comms room. Like this is, we kind of know, like we can do it pretty quickly from Tetra's perspective. But also her team kind of hummed and hawed over things, and I don't think was maybe as experienced. And so that's also slowed things down too, where it's like, we can just do this and we'll do it almost overnight. So tomorrow you can kind of see it, or in a couple days you can see it. So I think understanding who your client is and what their level of autonomy and authority is, which sometimes you don't find out until later.
Yeah, until you don't get the sign off.
Until you don't get the sign off, yeah.
So what do
until you lose the building.
Yeah, that must be a bit of a...
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you look for when in a building when you're doing this search? What points out the right building? Which...
I'm quite partial to biophilia, so I'm always looking for outdoor space. I think it's really important, including residential. I can't believe the percentage of places that don't have outdoor space. And post-pandemic, I think it's even that more important of just being able to open a window or step outside without having to fully leave and vacate the building. So outdoor space is a huge thing for me. That's one of my things. It's not a deal breaker for a lot of clients, but it is becoming less of an accepted default and more of an expectation for one of the amenities within their space. It could be within the building, it could be within their demise, which is nice. I think back to one of the projects I did years ago when I first moved to London, and we did this brandometer that would essentially measure how aligned a building was with this brand, and this brand was like very well known and quite like character heavy. So it needed to fit, and just a little like boring little white box wasn't going to work for this brand. And I still kind of have that in the back of my mind for every project that I'm doing, because ideally, and I said this to our own managing director, I said, we don't want to have to add stuff on the walls and crazy amounts of furniture and change massively whatever the Cat A is. We want to move into a space that feels like us, that we add to with a few accessories rather than having to overhaul to make it feel like us. And I think that same thing could be said for most clients when I'm looking at their spaces is like we were talking about before, how does this align to you? How do you just automatically feel? And it's like this really intangible thing to describe to a client, but it's a bit of a personality. You know, if you were a character, if you were a person, how would you describe this person? And that's kind of what you need to turn, but into a non-living element that is the building that needs to house you. And hopefully support your culture. So some of the things that I look for are, you know, how much daylight, obviously. What's the exposure? So there's certain buildings in London that I will recommend that my clients not go into because they're quite dark or they don't have good views. And I think it's really important for people who are coming in. It makes a huge difference. And I think people are more attuned to it now. Or if you hear people talking about it, you become more attuned. So I had a friend the other day who was telling me, I actually notice now how the sun moves through my space based on how you mentioned that you had, like, you know, looked for your flat back in the day. And I was like, cool. Like, that's,
Pretty
you
cool.
should. Yeah. Like, I hope it really works for you so that you're not just, in the dark all day.
I think that is actually, you talk about like the feeling when you walk into space. I love that because it's you go by that kind of gut feel when you are buying a property or renting a property personally.
Yeah.
And this is our home. Does it play to how we like to live and how we like to, or if we like to entertain, or if we've got pets, or if we've got family or whatever. And yeah, this will work for us, or no, it won't. And you could have two couples or families or whatever, exactly the same age and stage of life and everything like that. And one person will go into that house, it's just like, no way. And someone else will be like, yes way.
This is our dream home. And the other person's like, you could not pay me.
Yeah. And so there is no prescripts, is there?
No.
It is. I love that you actually immerse yourself in the brand enough to find out what's their vibe.
Yeah. It's quite innate for me at this point because I worked with brand managers way back in the day, and I took marketing at school originally and did experiential marketing where it was all about infusing yourself and kind of infusing yourself into the brand itself and then making it come to life in different ways. So for me, it's second nature. I don't even think about it. And sometimes I probably jump too many steps ahead without really like walking through and making sure. But I'm quite perceptive in terms of when I'm speaking to a client, gauging how that culture is based on how they come across, interactions with different people, how much they're going to involve other people, how the leadership is set up, maybe the hierarchy internally. It could be their like flexibility and working policies and how often they're in the office, and just little comments. Like you start to pick up on all of it, and you kind of like you kind of like sweep it under the rug, but you're very much cognizant of like what's hiding underneath there because you need to be aware of all those little things.
You're absorbing it.
Yeah. And as part of that, when you're looking at, for example, the core location of a building. So if this is our floor plate and you're the core, it means that we've got like a little bit of a horseshoe. And that might work if we have the T point in the middle and maybe there's like a skylight or an atrium. And that's like a really beautiful space where we can all, come together and have some social space. And maybe there's a terrace out there that's connected as well. And that really works really well. But for certain companies, it means that people on that side never converse with people on this side of the floor plate. So now we've effectively just cut the floor plate in half and we could be two different companies. And maybe one gets the sun in the morning and one doesn't get the sun in the afternoon because there's a building blocking it. All of a sudden, the two sides are going to, they're going to be polarized without anyone even realizing why or how that's happening. It's just going to happen. So little things in terms of how the internal interactions will play based on where the core is, where the sun is coming, what that exposure looks like, how the daylight hits, how social do you want them to be, is there external space? I had a client a few years ago who was consolidating into one space. I think they had 9 or 12 offices. I can't remember anymore. And they're all coming into one space, but the company itself was growing so quickly because it would basically merge and acquire, buying out any of their competition, and then just bringing them in-house, and then they decide who stays and who goes. And so it made for a really competitive, like an unsettled feeling within the company as a whole, because number one, no one was feeling amicable internally. No one was friendly because everyone was basically like, I don't know if I'm going to be here tomorrow, if you're going to be here tomorrow, or we're vying for the same job, or you're from a different company, I've never met you before. And so the space was created so that it was, as non-hierarchical as possible, aside from a few offices. And then this gigantic space, which was meant to be both a town hall space, but also co-working space during the day. And it had different lighting. It had a different ceiling. It was all like exposed waffle ceiling, which was really nice, like more warmer lighting. We changed the floor finishes. The furniture was soft seating, more colorful and bright. Everything else was kind of like gray and subdued around it. But this was like where you wanted to spend time. And it was very clear that like it was meant to be like a drawing point, separate to the tea point. But the idea was that all of the furniture there, you could actually do your job at. So even if you were sitting in that space, you could still be working at a sofa because it had, plug-in for your laptop. You could have a meeting, and it was more informal, but it was also meant to support and encourage more collaboration, but also just kind of building those internal social bonds and hopefully fostering and nurturing a workplace culture slowly, little by little. So I think sometimes when we talk about, workplace design or office design, we maybe dumb it down to, this is where I work. And it's like, in my mind, it's more than just where you work. This is where you're going to spend the majority of your time. And depending on how you're feeling about both going in, how you spent your day, and how you feel afterwards leaving it, that follows you throughout the weeks and the months and the years, because that's going to change how you go on vacation, how you spend money on your time off, including like, oh, I'm getting delivery tonight because I worked really hard and I work really hard, so therefore I should treat myself. And it's like, actually, you're gonna have to work that much harder if you're getting, takeaway at night, rather than just making something that's like really healthy and wholesome and then bringing it to lunch the next day. But that can accrue over time in terms of like just kind of like either building you up or kind of tearing you down. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to see what we do from a workplace design reality of, this is my perspective, but we're basically influencing society as a whole, because how you are leaving the office is going to indicate how you treat other people, how empathetic or understanding or patient you are. It follows you all the way through. Even when someone on the weekend is like, hey, how's work? Or like, how was your week? Like, it's either like this, dark, gloomy cloud over top, like the Charlie Brown character, or you're feeling really good and you're passionate and I was productive and I did this thing and, whatever it is that you originally took that job for, you're hopefully still getting that each week at some point, hopefully more than less, so that you are also kind of sharing that across. And if it's not that way, then you're slowly being kind of cut down and worn down over time. So
yeah, I can get very passionate about that. Like I wholly believe in it, like so much that it might never even be that work crops up in conversation, but your state of mind based on how you are at work. And there's a saying, isn't it? You are the average of the top 5 people you spend the most time with. Well, they're very likely 2 or 3 of those are going to be from work.
that's true.
And if like those people, I was talking to someone the other day about taking a job, and I was like, well, and we're talking about the industry and whether it was relevant to him and everything like that. That's the questions he was asking. I was like, actually, don't worry about that. Talk to me about the person that you're reporting to and the person that you're walking alongside, because that's actually all that matters at the moment. And then you can start working out those more like smaller detail things. But if you're with good people, and essentially that creates a culture, your life is you will think differently, you'll be more creative, you'll do more you'll go so much further in life than you ever imagined.
It's the thrive versus survive mentality, right?
Yeah. No, I think that, and to think that can all come down to a workplace and the location and the design of it, and obviously the managers and the leadership team are totally, but to think that these people and these spaces have this huge impact on how we live and behave. And
Well, we're making decisions right now. So, perfect example, stay or go for some of our clients who are moving into spaces over the next 5 years, or potentially that have just moved in who are going to be there for another 15 years. That's influencing Gen Alpha, who will then be in the workforce by that point. Like, I'm thinking of my nieces and nephews, I'm like, they will be working in this office at that point, like 15 years. Like, yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
It is. What are some of the common mistakes that people make when they're looking for a space?
I understand why budget is a huge factor, but I don't think that people really take into account the entire budget that's involved, because if you get it right and you have a great space, which is attracting great talent, but also retaining the great talent that you want, the original CapEx outlay could save you down the line for recruiting and training costs far more than you had anticipated. And so I think sometimes we don't marry up those two. You only see them as capital expenditures. Similarly with looking at furniture, you could do a 5-year fit out. We're probably going to leave in 5 years. We're anticipating our growth. We're going to be out of this building. It can't sustain us, but in the meantime, this is all we need. And not buying for the future, just buying some really cheap stuff for the moment to get you by. And it's a bit like the fast fashion world where you're like, you could buy it from the ASOS version, you could buy IKEA or something that's a little bit higher and you can call it workplace, but really, like, it's going to be done by 5 years. Like, you're going to notice this after 3 years, it's going to look tired. Whereas they could spend a little bit more and know that actually this investment is going to be long-term. But so many of the boards, I had a client conversation about this on Monday where he said, at his company, every 4 years there's a new board. And of course they want to change everything. They want to change the direction. They want it to be about them. And it's very short-sighted thinking. Whereas when I have conversations with my grandpa, he used to be the mayor of our city where I grew up. And he was always going against the short-term grain, thinking about the long-term. So he was thinking more like, how are we urban planning for the future that we don't know that we are going to need? How is this going to work? How are we connecting all these different elements to our, downtown city center? Mm-hmm. Are we building, community spaces that everyone can use for the public? How are we creating these spaces so that the youth of the future have somewhere to go and spend time doing something healthy and worthwhile and connecting with adults? How are we volunteering or helping, the elderly? Like, it was such a strategic long-term view. And I remember, I was young, but even as a teenager, I remember reading articles about people who were really against this idea because they wanted fast, ideas and changing things, but it was going to be really expensive. And he was like, I'm setting out a budget that works for 30 years. And here, like, there is a vision, but you can't get the vision right away. Like, we don't have enough money and we don't need all that money right now, but here's how we're going to do it. And it was, I think, a very, I don't want to say traditional because it's not the bad version of traditional, and not that traditional has to be, but it was a very, like, risk-averse, old-school version of, until we have the money for it, we won't be doing it. Whereas our generations now are like, oh, we'll just buy it and figure it out, or we'll just go into debt to make this thing happen. And part of that is it was easier to build that up, I think, back in the day, whereas now everyone is priced out of a lot of things. But the way that he was really blocking his way through it, and then it gives you time to like learn and adjust and pivot and build on, like, slowly, planning by and by. Whereas even now, we're making these decisions for 15 years in advance. It's like, I have no idea what we're going to be doing in 15 years. It's like, I moved a client into a space. I have a 15-year lease. Last year, they moved in, and within 6 months, they were already over their 15-year growth prediction. And people are coming into the office more than they were expecting them to, because the space is great and they love coming in and they're more productive and they like this space. And it's a great case study, but it's also like, do we need to get another floor in the building? What are we, you have this for 15 years. When we're planning, yes, it was always, we'll go into this building so we have options and, first offer of refusal, that's fine. First right of refusal. But I think we've spent more time figuring out how we would demise different floors and sublet them, or what would the landlord take back, or which floor would we get rid of where we could, cut out the stairs and fill in the slab and cut that floor off. Like we were thinking of it more in terms of what goes wrong because we had been planning it during the pandemic versus, okay, we're 6 months in and we still have 14 and a half years left to go on this lease. Now what?
And we've already
we really weren't expecting this. So when I called the client and I was like, hey, so post-occupancy survey, and he's like, well, we've smashed all of our goals. He's like, which at the moment is a good thing. He's like, but I'm just not sure where we go from here. I don't think it's something that we're going to sustain. This is crazy growth at the moment. So I'm sure it's going to go down before it goes up again. He said, but all of the numbers are positive. We're more profitable. We're more productive. People are happier. Our attendance is up. Their slowest day on a Monday or Friday, I guess it's Friday, their slowest days in January, February of this year, 2024, were the equivalent of their peak attendance on a Wednesday 5 years ago when we had been doing the occupancy studies and space utilization studies.
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm. It's like a completely different company. And you can say that, and it sounds like I'm being quite flippant as part of the design team and project team, but I spent a lot of time with this company over 4 years, so I know a lot of the people. I can walk through on any floor and say hello to multiple people, no problem. And it's the receptionist who actually said, who's an older woman and super lovely. Their receptionists are all just wonderful. The warm welcome. It's like going to grandma's house, it's so nice. And one of them said to me, because I was like, oh, any feedback? Has anyone said anything? She goes, well, I have feedback. She goes, I want you to know that from that very first day when we came in, she said, I thought that I felt like not only was I in a new building, but that I was at a new company, that I had started a new job after, I think she'd been there for 25 or 30 years. She said, I feel like I'm at a new company. She's like, I have so much energy. I'm reinvigorated. I'm so excited. I have so much more passion. She goes, I feel like a different woman. And I feel like I'm 10 or 15 years younger because there's just more energy. There's more happening. Everyone is excited. There's just more movement. There's more happening. She said, so instead of being in a quiet, dark, cold, uninspiring, empty space, which is where her reception was kind of located before, she goes, and not that there's anything bad, she looked out onto a sweet little garden, but she said completely different. She's like, it's absolutely night and day, and I don't know how else to tell you how extreme it is, but I feel like a different person in a different company, and it feels like everyone has morphed into new people, even though I know every single person that works here.
And then we talk about how the workspace and culture can impact your life beyond the office.
Guaranteed. She's a completely different, grandparent,
Yeah, of course she is. Amazing.
Yeah, I would this
is fantastic.
Yes. More of these stories.
We need to get her out there.
I know.
Talking to the world, sharing it, because that is real life case studies, and the receptionists matter. That's a human being. They've got dependent.
That's your first impression, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think
it could
everybody
be a new
matters.
Client who's never seen inside this office, and maybe they go to 4 different companies and, having different meetings, and all of a sudden they come into this one and it's just like, boom, you can feel it. Like it's going to be palpable. Every time I go in there, it's like it is buzzing. Even if it's like a quiet client suite and it's a Monday and they don't have any meetings or events going on, you can still feel this like hum. I don't know how else to say it, but like, that stuff is happening. Whereas in their old building, I mean, it couldn't have been any worse. Like, it was old and dank and dark and no views. Most of the windows were, I think when we were doing space utilization and our workplace study, the scaffolding on the exterior of the building was being put up. So all of the windows were being covered as well. So like it just felt like the entire building was encased in a basement. The technology didn't work and the mechanical system wasn't really working. So it was either really hot or really cold. And back to the story of like the core being in the wrong place, like the 2 sides. Okay, so here's something I can tell you. This same client who moved into their new space was telling me that one of the partners from one of the departments who'd been working there for 35 years had just bumped into, at an event the week before, another partner from the same team who sat on the same floor as him for over 30 years, and they had only just met because they bumped into each other on the stairs and had a conversation. And he was like, I don't know how to package this up and tell you, like, yeah, the space works, but like, this is what we're dealing with. Whereas before, when we were doing, surveys, it was very palpable that people on the same floor, even if they were in the same department, they might bump into each other in the tea point, but they're sitting in their offices doing their own thing all day, every day, week in, week out. Whereas now, everyone can kind of move around, and like, you have your own neighborhood, but maybe the teams are shifting to a different area and having a presentation in this, different room on a different floor in a different neighborhood kind of thing, because everything is a shared resource. And suddenly, people are migrating from one area to the next, or you're having a discussion because you feel good and you're happy about the space that you're in, and you're having a conversation in this social tea point lounge. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're Joe. Yeah. We've worked together for decades.
For me,
which is just like this, what?
Yeah, I can't actually comprehend it or take it in because we're a small business, and so like there's everybody knows everybody's, like, don't know, girlfriend's name or boyfriend's name, and do you know what I mean? It's all like, we're small, so it's not like that. But I was actually at a company doing a presentation, doing a presentation. I don't want to give it out away where it was. I've got to be careful. And because of the presentation, 2 people came down and met.
Yeah.
And were like, oh, hello. Like, they knew each other from their previous companies. They had worked together and had both been at this company for 10 years. And they're like, oh, how long have you worked here? Like, when did you start? And they're like, 10 years ago. And I'm like, oh, I've been 11 years or something like that. And it was just like, oh, but we've never spoken. And I just looked at them, was like, really?
Is it a massive company?
Yeah. But I would have thought it'd be quite a lot of collaboration between everyone, but clearly not these 2 people.
I think in certain
amazing
companies, but also certain industries, collaboration is being pushed a lot harder. And I will drone on and on about legal because I've been doing a lot of legal projects recently, but just this idea of entrepreneurial spirit and seeing things from a different perspective, like, how can this benefit everyone, not just me? Whereas I think those more traditional, I would say investment is kind of the same thing, where a more traditional mindset of it's all about me and how I make a difference and how do I benefit. And now it's like, we're going from me to we. So both in terms of spaces, so less one-person offices and more, how do we have shared resources so we all get more out of this when we come in? We all benefit. but also in terms of how does the wider company and other departments, how are we sharing things? How are we sharing knowledge and experience? It might be different people who can help each other out. I think companies who have like training experience or management trainees who kind of do the full gamut through the whole company. I had some friends who did this when I was younger at different companies, and they had insight into each of the different departments and could speak to it. But then they would go and speak to each of the leaders as well and say, you know, during my 3 months in such and such department, I noticed X, Y, and Z, or these seem to be the challenges, or this is what was constantly coming up on our list, or, you know, complaints, or, you know, these were my insights as someone who's new to this department that maybe someone else wouldn't notice, having only ever been in that department. You know, they do this process differently or whatever. And I think when you have knowledge sharing across departments, it kind of goes back to that empathetic idea, but also the entrepreneurial, like how can we help each other out? Or how do I change my process so you don't actually have as much work, or you can speed up what you're doing based on me asking 3 questions 6 months in advance, kind of thing. And I'd say that's hopefully something that I'm doing more and more in my role too, is not only unlocking hidden value for our clients, but also unlocking that hidden value for ourselves in terms of how do we do things slightly differently, or how do we bring someone in a little bit earlier, or how am I creating an opportunity to bring someone else and their expertise into this amazing opportunity that maybe the client wouldn't have asked for originally, but I'm like, this is going to change or revolutionize the opportunity for this project. So
unlocking hidden value.
Unlocking hidden value.
Nice. It's a nice word.
Yeah.
So talking about collaboration, and really people and how they feel, and yeah, great. It's love. How should people feel and engage in a workspace?
I think it goes back to collaboration, but not at the risk of being detrimental to productivity and the ability to get what you need done. And that's going to change with different people and generations and shifting cultures. Your workplace culture is going to ebb and flow depending on who's coming in and who's leaving. How are they now relating? Like, how is everyone kind of moving up the ladder, and who's now becoming management, where they're no longer really, they're creating the culture, but at a different level. Now it's at the management or leadership level. It's not so much at like the day-to-day, I don't want to say people level because everyone's people, but like the
operational level.
Yeah, the doers who are coming in and like really need to be feeling it and feeling like they're part of it as well. So I think that's a big shift. I know we've seen that in our own company as people have progressed over many years, how that's kind of changing internally, how people interact, which is really interesting to see. Yeah, I think making sure that goes back to our belonging element, you know, do people feel like there's a vision for the company? Like, what are they working towards? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Like, do we feel like at some point we get to breathe a sigh of relief or celebrate something, be acknowledged and feel like we've achieved something? Or is it just constantly like more growth and bigger targets and on to the next year? And are you taking a second to step back and talk about lessons learned and really acknowledging here are the challenges, you know? If you're only talking about efficiencies and productivity, I mean, we're people. We're not going to work 100% of the time on time with no human errors. Like, that's not how we are. I was reading a really good quote the other day that said, in nature, nothing blooms all year round. So why would we expect ourselves to do that as well? And I was like, yeah, that's actually a really good point. Like, we're being seen as kind of back to the industrial revolution of just these like assembly line workers, and it does change. And I think especially for women, hormonal changes, but it is going to change over time. And sometimes we're going to be like on it, and sometimes we're going to need to like just take a step back. And I don't think guys fully appreciate that. They just kind of have this baseline, right, really consistently. And it's no clearer than when you see these like Instagram or TikToks of like a couple who are working out, and she's showing like her different phases of her cycle, and the guy is just doing his thing, like no change day by day unless he's like got the man flu, and she's like on it, not on it, dead, like flat out. And I think we have to consider that to a certain degree within our workplace too, is there are a lot of competing elements, and especially with women being caregivers, and a lot of the extra mental as well as just family load goes on women, and it's just kind of it's being talked about, but I don't know that guys fully get it because they don't think that way. And it's hard to get guys to really understand that, like really see what goes in. Yeah. Because if there's no way for us to take all of the questions and things that are popping up. And like some of them are random. Like I'll put stuff on my to-do list that I'm like, I would love to cross this out, but it's just going to keep popping up. So I'm going to mark it down. Meanwhile, it could be like learn a new language or like go and travel to this place. And it's like, I'll probably never go and travel to this place, but like it keeps popping up. But there are things that come up for women who are considering things, and it could be like a family thing or a relationship thing. It could be a work thing. It could be management, what they want to do with their career, what they want to do with their family. Like there's so many more things. Whereas I feel like guys have been quite programmed, like it's about working and career and being driven. And I hear this between my sister and my brother-in-law, actually, where my brother-in-law feels pressure to constantly be doing more at work and attaining more. And he does it because that's where he, not that he isn't proud of his family, but that's where he has excelled, is in his career. And a lot of times when there's been a compromise, work has won out, because he is the sole breadwinner and he is responsible for providing for the family. And so there's a lot of pressure on him. And especially once you make it to a certain level, no doesn't really, even if you're a partner at a company, no doesn't really feel like it's an opportunity. And then I hear it from my sister, who's like, I wish she would just come home a little earlier. I wish she could just, drop off. And I see her perspective, and I understand that she wants the best for their family and wants him to spend time with the kids and come home early so she can go off and do something too. And it goes back to being empathetic of others and seeing their perspective, but also understanding like our societal values of what's been ingrained in us and what is most important. And therefore, if you're doing that, then, you shouldn't really be complaining about anything. Whereas I think when we come down to a slightly more feminist perspective and egalitarian, equal perspective, it's like, well, actually, I should be able to demand that you take off early one day and you start early enough every single day. So yeah, come home earlier and do this thing and help me take the kids to somewhere, whatever it is. So
yeah, I agree.
I think there's a lot of pressure, and especially with the generations that we're dealing with, like multiple generations in the industry and in the workplace right now, until a little bit more moves on, I think it's going to be hard to make a shift. But I think once part of the old guard has shifted, I think it's going to open up new opportunities. And we're already seeing that. I mean, there's a quote the other day that, what was it, 90% of Gen Z associates said that flexibility was the most important thing to them in law firms. So they would reconsider where they would move or which company that they would go to based on the workplace culture, as it should be.
Exactly.
But that never would have happened 10 years ago.
No, but if they've got the flexibility, they're male, they can then help out, be there, cover while
and make some of those bigger generational changes too, right? Yeah.
So then things start to become more equal. And I also really think it's down to each individual, and there's no right and wrong in terms of them, but like each individual person's priorities, because like for me, it's really important to do X, Y, Z, and I don't care if X, Y, and A, B, and C rips. I'm doing X, Y, and Z. Like that is it. I've made my choices. I'm doing that. Whereas
Yeah.
other people, I can just see they've got different priorities. And
Well, and it shifts over time too, right? So at some point, career is going to be the number one thing because you don't have a whole lot of other things, especially in London. People come here for their career. They're going to push the other things aside because they might not know people here. They might not have a life outside of their career, or they're here to make money to send home for whatever reason. I have a ton of friends who are sending money back to their families because either their parents are older and don't have enough saved up or need extra care or in a care home. Helping family out from a different perspective. And so when you look at why people are putting so much of themselves into work, a lot of the times it's not the paycheck, it's what the paycheck can then afford them. And that goes back to like this empathetic thinking of, how do we help people out and how do we assume that it's all for the best as well?
You've done so much. What's the most exciting project you've worked on?
There's a few. So one of them was a few years ago, which was quite boundary pushing in terms of what we did from an internal branding perspective, aligning with the workplace culture, which was a lot of fun. That was Deliveroo a few years ago, which was a blast. I just finished a project with our team after 4 years, and which is a long time.
Yeah.
Which, as you can recall, was why I got out of my last.
I was just going to say, you like this fast-paced.
No. But we needed that much time to slowly go through things, so that's fine. And it was worth the wait because of just the black and white extreme from a transformation process. Like it really was interesting. That's where I was telling you that the receptionist was feeling like she was a new place, new person.
Oh, that's worth it.
So this has been top to bottom, and we're hoping to follow up with a 1 year on. Are you still as excited about the space? How are you utilizing it? That type of thing. But my favorite project, and I think probably the most interesting too, realistically, was working on an ad agency a few years ago. And the client definitely helped to make it a great opportunity because he was open to anything that, I think he had three rules, if I think back to it. One was, if you've seen it done before, don't even think about it. So don't take something from Pinterest and then try and turn it into our thing, which I was like, awesome, amazing, because I don't work that way anyways. The second was, if it's in any way corporate, it will not work in this space. I was like, great, because we do corporate workspace, but this is really nice to do something different. And the third one, which we came up together, I think we had done a tour of his site, walked through the space, and at one point there were cracks in the ground. They had this white resin concrete floor. And at one point I said, what are your thoughts in terms of the cracks? What does a landlord say? Is there going to be a contribution? What do you guys think? And he was like, oh, just have to redo the floor. I was like, but then if we redo the floor, it's going to look brand new, shiny, polished, and finished. And nothing else here is really brand new, shiny, polished, and finished. What about if we get I'm not saying gold grout, but something like wabi sabi, this Japanese idea. And this is 6 years ago. This is before everyone started doing reception desks that were cracked with gold grout. But it was a few years before that. And I just said, what about if we celebrate the fact that it's cracked and do something to kind of highlight it rather than try and hide it and conceal it? And he was like, I love that. And I was like, well, that's kind of the concept that I'd like to bring in as a whole for this, which is, could we look at repurposing furniture and furnishings and lighting so we get everything for the most part reused, I think except for curtains from you, because they had to be fire rated specifically. But even things like there's a cinema and we got an old Persian rug instead of a carpet. We did get some curtains from eBay because they were like a really dusty rose velvet, which was perfect for the acoustics of the cinema, but then we had them fire rated.
I know the ones.
Yeah. The door to the cinema, like we found online, it's like I don't know where it's from. I don't even want to know, actually. It looks like it could be from like Torture Garden or something. Like, it was really interesting. But like black tufted leather with like a jewel like doorknob or something. So super random. But the whole idea was like find things that work within this space. Even things like, so we used dead stock. So for example, we had to build out new bathrooms just based on the additional head count going into the space.
Mm-hmm.
And so those were, I think, the only new partitions. Everything else was using curtains to kind of partition off spaces. So we had to build new bathrooms, but the compromise was we'll get some dead stock in terms of the sanity ware. So we got old toilets and like wash basins and even tiles that were considered dead stock and carbon neutral because they had been sitting since I think the 80s in a warehouse. So they're unused, they're brand new. I mean, we went for like avocado green and dusty rose and like robin's egg blue. So, but we could play with it in this space because everything else is kind of like a reused, it kind of fits. I don't encourage that for everybody because I don't think everyone wants an avocado green bathroom, but it was fun to be able to repurpose this and do it in a really bold kind of a bold way of, you know, this is the brand and they are willing to do this and it is going to be great. And it also matches with roughly the era that this furniture is from that you're also sitting on that we've managed to collect. So that was really cool. Even like the joinery was old floorboards from a priory that we had refinished, which is fun. And the bases of all of they didn't have desks, but they had tables. And all of the desk tables, the bases were vintage Victorian radiators that we had sanded down and then painted white, which was I think probably my favorite thing about the whole thing. It looked really cool. And you didn't really notice it when you came in because the flooring had been refinished to white, but not like sparkly, shiny white. So you didn't really notice the legs, like the underside of the desk or the tables. But when you did, you were like, wait a second. And you kind of took a second look like, is that what I think it is?
Big column radiators.
Yeah.
I know the Victorian ones.
Yeah. Trying to think of like what else we did. We also found, things like signage and branding. Again, we didn't want to make new things unnecessarily. There's enough stuff in our world to go around and around multiple times. So I found some they're called French mannequins, but they're so old, like, I don't even know how many decades. But they're just like wooden, almost like plywood pieces. But we use those as like the signage. So you could, using like, I guess, chalk, you could actually write out or, you know, position what the brand name is because they had a bunch of like smaller incubator kind of companies on the floor. And just, I don't know, creative perspectives of what to use without buying new. Our planters were old chimney pots that had been repurposed. Just fun stuff like that. So
love that.
It kind of goes back to our very first part of our conversation, which is, you know, yes, you want to reuse stuff. No, not every project will be like that. But how can you be creative and how can you allow yourself a certain amount of time and a certain amount of the budget to have a more circular, circular effort going into this project, knowing that this company is probably going to be around for more than 5 years. And these materials need to last, but they also need to be able to shift and be timeless. So Some of them are going to work because they are timeless for that time period, and people are gonna fall in and out of love with them. But if they're built the right way, you can refinish them to almost have a new life, like revitalize them, so that they can be reused multiple times within their own lifespan.
I also think when something is literally eclectic and it's kind of, it's almost, that is the style. It's like it is just it. It doesn't really go
Yeah.
in and out of style. That is the style, and it's kind of really museum-y, like just really interesting. It's like deeply meaningful and like so much story. Like you don't even have to know the story, but it's intrinsic. Like it's obvious there's a deep meaning.
Yeah.
And I think that's so lovely when you walk through a space. It just automatically is timeless because it's not picking from any era or fashion specifically one. It's everything.
What I like about that project too is even though it's not to everyone's aesthetic and it won't work for every single company, and not every designer will be able to replicate that because their style will differ. But what I like about it is we can talk about it, and everyone is interested, especially now because circular design is a bigger point of or big topic to contend with. And we're talking about sustainability, and we're talking about decarbonization, and dead stock at the time, like no one really knew what dead stock was unless it was a fabric and you were in the fashion industry. Whereas now it's becoming a little bit more widespread, and I like the fact that people are talking about it more, and we can share these stories of this project has happened. Like I can say I have done a project that is just about entirely carbon neutral, other than offsetting, the delivery of said pieces, but it's all essentially dead stock because it's decades old.
And to think that happened how many years ago?
Like 5 years ago, maybe. Yeah.
Must have been something to wrap their heads around. I mean, they clearly, the client were like fairly forward thinking, but
super forward
that to
thinking,
be
exactly.
happening like 2019.
It was before the pandemic. It wrapped up before the pandemic.
Yeah, that's 2018, 19 then. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And brilliant. And to think what we could be doing, how much further on we should be and could be now.
Yeah.
Whereas we're only really sort of talking about that now.
But I
Like
also
in
think,
mainstream.
like, to be fair to designers, because I've gone through this myself, where you want a sparkly, shiny, everything new, looks fabulous project. And you kind of have to mature in your design career and professionalism to go, actually, it doesn't have to be all brand new anymore. Like maybe we do 50-50 on this project, and what are the elements that we can take? It also depends on like, what does a client have that could be repurposed? I mean, I remember working with a client and most of the stuff that they bought was from IKEA and made.com. And I was like, so we're not bringing anything from this project. Like, don't even think about it. To other clients where they're like, oh, we're just assuming that we wouldn't bring anything. And I'm looking at their furniture like, no, you should be keeping this. I mean, this is fantastic. You spent a lot of money on this 10 years ago or 12 years ago. I don't even think these leather chairs from the entire client suite need to be redone. So I had one client recently who they wanted to update the private dining room for the partners of this legal firm. And they're like, we don't have the budget at this point because we're probably going to move in a few years, but like, what could we do? And I was like, no budget and make it feel completely different, right?
Easy.
Yeah, just refurbish it overnight, Jenny. But we made some adjustments to the lighting. We got the carpet changed out. We did some French polishing to all the wooden wall panels around the space. We kept the tables because they're burled oak and they're stunning, but they didn't quite work with the colors because it's quite a yellow color, the burled oak. So we had to adjust a few things. And one of the things that we did was take these like kind of like dirty beige chairs, and we relocated and replaced them with leather chairs from the client suite so they could work in the client suite a little bit better, and then moved the darker chairs from the client suite into the private dining room, and it looks completely different. And I was like, as long as you're happy with what's happening in the client suite, then like it's a no-brainer. And they're like, we love it. It looks amazing. So added some new paint on a few things, got the right color of white that wasn't blindingly bright white, just the right color, and picked some artwork from their massive collection in the basement.
Just because
it just happens, it happens to be there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Made a couple changes around like the acoustics for the adjoining kitchen and catering space, and changed out the tile. And even with those small changes, it does look like a completely different space.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, like it's the same space, but it feels like it has been updated massively.
And it feels different. Yeah, you got the vibe. Yeah, no.
And we changed the corridor coming into the space because it was like really dark. You're taking an escalator up to their floors, like to the client floors. And then you go through a corridor and it's blindingly bright. It feels like you are walking through, like, in movies when you're, going to heaven, it's like the bright white lights kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or a dentist's studio or office where it's like just like clinically bright. So we changed that, lowered the lighting like lux levels, added some like wall washers, changed the color of the wall, added some art rails, added some artwork. Yeah, just made it a little more palatable so that when you walk between the spaces, it flows a little bit nicer, rather than you're getting very different experiences within each, because you could have 4 different, I guess 5, 6. So the ground floor reception, taking the escalator up, client reception, walking through the corridor into this like really low ceilinged lobby, and then into the private dining space. Like that's a lot of different transitions. So we were trying to make it feel a little bit more seamless through them. So yeah, team did a good job.
Yeah, that sounds, I want to go there.
Yeah. I'll share some
I actually
pics.
love those projects where it's not, I mean, all that the new and everything like that is exciting too, but sometimes when people have had to work with existing and not maybe have a big budget, you can get really creative.
Exactly.
And like really
It's
like pushes
fun.
your boundaries, right?
It kind of, it not that it's the same thing, but it kind of reminds me a little bit of being in design school. And I did quite a bit of freelancing when I was in design school too, where I'd have zero budget and friends would be like, hey, can you help me redo this kitchen and living room? And you're trying to come up with ideas knowing that they don't have 10 grand to spend on this space because it's your friends who have just moved into a new house, right? But you're trying to help them out. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, I would have clients who had way more money than I was anticipating ever making myself, but they also don't want to spend any money. So you're trying to come up with clever things to fix up their space. And so it kind of goes back to like, at the beginning of my career maybe, where you have to think out of the box. And it's the unexpected stuff that's going to work that they wouldn't have thought of themselves. And that's what you kind of have to pitch. So yeah, that's what makes it fun.
That was a lot of information, a lot of intelligence. I think a junior designer listening could learn loads from you. A workplace director, someone looking at a new space going forward could learn a lot. So that's, amazing. Thank you, Jeni.
Thank you.
Before you go though, I want to ask you one question, which not everyone knows how to answer. So it's do it how you like.
Pressure's on.
Yeah. What would you do with a magic wand?
Okay. I am going to go back to my golden rule. And I think with a magic wand, once you kind of do your thing with the magic wand, a bit like Cinderella, or I guess the fairy godmother, not Cinderella, but the fairy godmother to Cinderella, would automatically give that person the empathetic mindset or perspective to see things from other people's perspectives that they wouldn't necessarily have experience in themselves.
I love that. What a wicked answer, off the cuff.
Thanks.
What to do with magic wand. Love it. Thanks, Jeni.
Thank you very much for listening. I'm also very grateful to all our guests. If you've enjoyed it, please do leave us a rating and a follow. Or if you know who else would like to join the podcast, share the names. We're always open to hearing. Until next time, keep happy, keep healthy, and take care.